It's something like, God does not coerce and overpower, but God engages us in our freedom.
Hi everybody, I'm Darnell Miller with Mac Studios at the University of St. Thomas, and I'm here at the University of St. Thomas for the Duke and Altum Schools Summit, and I'm here with?
Dr. Brett Sockold.
Perfect, and where are you coming in from, Doctor?
I'm from Regina, Saskatchewan, so the Great White North. I came in actually via North Dakota, but I live and work in Regina, Saskatchewan when I'm not on the road doing this kind of thing.
And so here at this DIA Summit, what do you hope people walk away with? You know, we're here with a bunch of educators from across the United States. What do you hope they learn and take with them as they go back out to serve these students again?
Right. I mean, well, there's lots of great things to learn from all kinds of great presenters. From my particular angle, I want to give them the sense that a lot of people think we should do what I'm proposing, but they don't always have a picture of how. And so I want to give them a sense that it's possible, that you can do it with integrity, you can do it with authenticity and with imagination. And once you start to see it, once it becomes a possibility in your imagination, there's sort of no limit, and I've been amazed to see, lesson plans or conversations around things you would never guess, tenses in like world languages or fractions in math or aviation or, but once you get the idea that you can ask certain kinds of questions that contextualize what we're doing within the larger picture of the Christian anthropology, what is a person for? What are our goals here? It's really possible to do this. And once teachers get it, once that clicks, they really, I've seen the switch happen where they go from thinking like, wow, this topic is an exception. You can't really do this one. Yeah. To like, oh, wait, now I see it. And then I'm off to the races,
That's amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and we wish you the best in your continued work as we continue to figure out how to better educate our Catholic children.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
God bless. I was working with a small Catholic college in Regina that was having trouble getting enough registrations in their Catholic studies courses, and the president said, well, what if we offered a course for aspiring Catholic teachers? There's an ed faculty on campus in Canada. Sometimes we have Catholic colleges on secular university campuses. And like a quarter of those teachers are going to go work in Catholic schools. What if we offered a course for them? So we went to the Catholic School Board's office and we asked them this question. If you were hiring someone with only one course in Catholic education, what would you want them to study in that one course? And they said three things. Curriculum permeation, and if you know how these lists work, you get one guess for what they said third, curriculum permeation. And I said, that's interesting, what is it? I had a doctorate in theology, I had an ed degree from the U of R, and I had never heard of this. And they said, well, a Catholic school shouldn't just be like a public school, but with religion, class, and a crucifix, but the way you approach math or health or social studies should be from a Catholic point of view. I said, that sounds like a great idea. Do you have like a textbook or like something I could use to teach this course? And they said, no, really, we don't know of anything that's available. So I had to sort of build that course from scratch. Some of us have been in that position where you're teaching something for the first time. You're like 1 week ahead of the students. That was the situation. That hit home. Okay, yeah. I feel ya. And by the end of the semester, we were all so excited. We felt like we had found something that could be really transformative. And so I thought, I need to get this to more people. And that was the beginning of what became the book. And I'm so excited with the generous reception I've had, especially here at Duke and Altum about the book. So today we're going to walk through three quick things. Foundation, imagination, process. Someone yesterday heard me say process. They say, is that how you say it in Canada? And I had to stop and think, and here's the deal. If it's a noun, yes. If it's a verb, it's process. Probably the same in Minnesota, right? We're almost the same? Yeah, okay. So I walked into class on the first day, and before we did the syllabus, before we did the introductions, I said, get out a pen and paper, and you're going to learn what you think by writing. And I wrote a question on the board, and I think Jackie must have been in my class, because Jackie made the point to us last night that we need to know what we're for. And I wrote this question on the board, what are people for? And I asked them to get out pen and paper and write their answers. Now, why this question at the beginning of a course for prospective Catholic teachers? Well, every education presumes an anthropology. It might be explicit, it might be implicit, it might be intentional, it might be willy-nilly, but an education imagines that people are for some goal or set of goals and will be oriented towards those goals. You can imagine some of the answers that my students wrote. They wrote things like, people are made for love, people are made for service, people are made for community. Nobody wrote that people are made to make as much money as they can before they die. Nobody said that. When I was searching for an image for the rat race, I found this comic, which I think is great. I also found a great quote that said, the thing about a rat race is, even when you win, you're still a rat. None of them gave me an economic answer when I asked them, what are people for? But my guess is, if you ask the person on the street, why should kids go to school? Probably 90+% of the time, you'll get an economic answer, right? And so now we're all for, having employable graduates, right? Nothing wrong with that. But we also don't want to give our kids the impression that that's the answer to their life's question. But if education is implicitly or explicitly organized around the idea that your goal as a creature is to get a job so you can afford a kitchen reno in your 40s, then we're missing something, right? So we have better answers than that in our tradition. The love and service and community, those are all good answers. They're all true. I think they all point in this direction. St. Augustine famously says, "You have made us for yourself, O God, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." If an education isn't ordered finally towards that, we're missing something. But the thing we know, of course, about aiming for the highest good is that the subordinate goods come along with it. You don't lose those other goods when you pursue the highest good. But when you pursue the lower goods, you can miss both, right? You guys know this character? The great Canadian comic actor Jim Carrey. He didn't quite say what St. Augustine said. If you know Jim Carrey, I mean, in the mid to late 1990s, the man could not stop making hit movies and making money. And he married a supermodel. He had all the things, right? You could argue that he was the best in the world at what he did at that time. Now, if you've followed his career at all, in the last several years, Jim Carrey has become a very thoughtful commentator on the human condition. I actually would recommend looking up some of his videos and watching them with your students. Just one representative quote, Jim Carrey says, "Everyone should get rich and famous, because then they'd learn that that's not what makes you happy," right? And Jim Carrey's experience is actually common across a whole range of human endeavor. People who make it to the very top in the arts, in sports, in business, in politics. You make it to the top and then you realize that wasn't the answer to my life's question. There has to be more than this. I was talking to an aviation teacher in Maryland who said when Neil Armstrong got back from the moon, he went into a deep depression. I mean, this is like the metaphorical pinnacle of human achievement, right? He literally went to the moon and then he had 30, 40 years to kill. What are you going to do? And so he had to find a better answer to that question, right? What is my life all about? What are people for? So to bring this back to curriculum permeation, this is edu-speak, right? This isn't Vaticanese, which is, not much more of a compliment than edu-speak. But anyways, the best quote that I could find from the Vatican documents describing what we mean by curriculum permeation, or sometimes it's called Catholic academic integration, it goes under many names, is this quote from the Catholic School on the Threshold of the Third Millennium. It says, "The endeavor to interweave reason and faith, which has become the heart of individual subjects, makes for unity, articulation, and coordination, bringing forth within what is learnt in school a Christian vision of the world, of life, of culture, and of history." In a Catholic school, we're making a proposal about the world and about the place of our students in that world, right? World, life, culture, and of history. And the Vatican says you make this proposal through the integration of faith and reason in every subject, right? And so that's what we're really going to zoom in on here for the next little bit, is thinking about what does it mean to reason and faith together at the heart of individual subjects, right? It's not that we do faith in religion class and we do reason in math class, but somehow faith and reason are involved in all of them. What does that look like? You know, we can do this for 12 different subjects and do it all day long. We're just going to do a couple really quick ones to spur our imaginations. And I got a request this morning already to start here, right? So if I tell someone on the airplane, you know, why I'm flying to Houston, well, I wrote a book about this for Catholic teachers, and they say, but math, right? So like 2 + 2 is 4, whether you believe in the resurrection or not. Someone in Montana the other day started the math problem with like 2 nuns were driving to Saskatchewan, you know. And I don't know, I've never been to Montana before, but the speed limit there is insane. So you could do the whole conversion of, you know, miles per hour to kilometers per hour, and the nun's got a speeding ticket and purgatory and whatever. But I think we can do better than that, right? It's not about word problems with sort of arbitrary Catholic content. Here's a way into this question, right? Students might ask you this: why should I study math? Now, if a student asks, why should I study math, what they're really asking you, this is a proxy question for a different question, right? The real question here is, what are people for? And more specifically, what am I for, and what does math have to do with that, right? Here's Miss Wormwood, if you remember Miss Wormwood. If there are no other questions, we'll move on to the next chapter. Of course, Calvin has a question. Certainly, Calvin, what is it? What's the point of human existence, right? I meant any questions about the subject at hand. Oh, frankly, I'd like to have the issue resolved before I expend any more energy on this, right? Students naturally ask big questions. They want to figure out why what they're doing matters. It's not so interesting that 2 + 2 is 4, but why does it matter and what does it mean that for my life that 2 + 2 is 4? So you can imagine answers that students might have heard to a question like, why should I study math? They might hear that you should study math to graduate. It's not wrong. You probably should. Notice how it sounds as an answer to the question, what are people for, right? There are people with more power than you who get to make rules, and you should follow them if you don't want to get in too much trouble and if you want to have a basically successful life, right? Now, we know how students respond to that kind of thing, right? Some of them are really good at jumping through hoops. Look at me go. I'm great at school. Give me higher hoops, narrower hoops, I can do it, right? Those students eventually have to find out that being good at school isn't the answer to their life's question either. But then we have other students, and they're not necessarily the ones who aren't so good at math, right? Sometimes it's our brightest students who say, yeah, I don't play that game. I don't do things because someone tells me arbitrarily that I should. We need to find some kind of internal motivation for those people, right? And when they find that internal motivation, we'll wind them up and watch them go, right? So we can do better than you should study math to graduate. You could study math to gain some marketable skills. Well, 3 cheers for marketable skills. I like driving on bridges that don't collapse as much as the next guy. We need people who can do math, right? Balance our books at the end of the year. As an answer to the question, what are people for? It says your life is about work, right? You're a cog in a machine. It's not a great answer for people who aren't planning on working in a mathematical field. So we can do a little better, right? We can expand it from sort of me getting a job to my contribution to society. And that's good. We're Catholics, 3 cheers for the common good, right? So we can study math and we can be a productive citizen. Well, nothing wrong with that. Again, not a great answer if you're not going to work in mathematical fields. I want us to be a little cautious about the language of productivity. I think it's very easy in our culture to imagine that productivity can be equated with value, right? And our kids can get the impression very easily that less productive people are less valuable people. I'm from Canada, where if you're a veteran who needs a wheelchair ramp put in, you could call Veterans Affairs and they might say something like, have you considered killing yourself? So I know the end of the game that starts by equating productivity and value. So productivity is good, but we have to be careful about how we think and how we talk about it. It can't be the goal of our life, right? Some of us are going to be, not as productive as others. Some of us are not going to be productive in any kind of measurable sense our whole lives. And those people have the same dignity and value as everyone else, right? So we can do better than that, right? And in a Catholic school, our approach to math is going to start not with some worldly ends, which are fine in themselves if they're kept in their right proportion, but with a sense of wonder at God's good creation. So here's just a quote from the Book of Wisdom. You have arranged all things by measure and number and weight. We could say something in response to this question, why should I study math? You could say something like, you are created to know and love God and God's works. And math is a unique and powerful way to explore the beauty and order of creation. I was talking to a math teacher in New Orleans who'd thought about this, and she had a ready answer when a student said, why should I study math? This teacher said, because you can. I love that answer. First of all, it's much easier to remember than this word salad. But note, I think she gets like 90% of this into that. If you think about what it means to say you can do math, we don't know anything else actually in creation that does math. I think angels can't do math. Their knowledge is immediate. Math is a mediated form of knowledge, right? You're the only thing we know, you 5-year-old, you're the only kind of thing we know that can conceive of threeness, right? But you could ask students to bring you a 3 to class. It would be really interesting to see what they come up with. They might bring you 3 items, 3 cookies, 3 apples. They might bring you a mark on a paper that their culture has agreed indicates threeness, but they can only read that number and make sense of it or distinguish 3 mushrooms from 4 mushrooms because they can abstract from material reality into a spiritual reality because they have a rational mind. And we don't know anything else that does that, right? And so when we study math, we study the beauty and order and the wonder of creation. We can also teach children to wonder at their own gifts, their own being made in the image of God, and their own particular vocation in creation, which is unique, right? You little math doer, you, look at you go. We don't know anything else like you. You could say you're a creature endowed by God with will and intellect, tasked with the stewardship of creation, which includes developing the remarkable potential God has built into creation. You see how this is getting at the same kind of thing as the productive citizen kind of thing? But the framework is completely different, right? The framework is stewardship and vocation. So it has something particular for people who are inclined towards math, but it says something about math and the human project before God, right? You could say humans are built for truth, and studying math is a great way to learn, to pursue, and to love the truth. I was talking to another teacher. She was teaching at a Catholic school during the day and doing a master's degree at a secular university at night. And everything was deconstructed at her master's program. And she said she would come home from class in the evening morally and spiritually exhausted because anything that she thought was true was like problematic, right? And so to restore her soul after this barrage, she did Sudoku puzzles, right? Because it's hard to deconstruct a Sudoku puzzle. And that's why we love them. Because when we know that the 9 goes in that square and nothing else goes in that square, we know something true and we're made for that, right? And the beauty of math is that the truth of it is so self-evident that once you see it, you can't not see it. Math teachers tell me when they first introduce the idea of irrational numbers, students are like, yeah, that can't be right. Like you can't, that's not a thing. How long does it take to demonstrate that they're a thing? 8 minutes? And once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? The truth proposes itself with a kind of clarity in math that refreshes the human spirit and teaches us something about our own need for and pursuit for truth across other areas of knowledge, right? Which brings us to a last thing. We should study math because it's fun. We should recognize that this is a thing that humans do because we're curious and because we want to know true things. One morning, does anyone know the pancake problem? It's like how many, like maximum number pieces of pancake for minimum number of slices. My kids independently came up with this almost by accident over breakfast one morning. We spent like an hour and a half sorting through the pancake problem, and we looked it up on the internet and found out it's called the pancake problem. And it's just a ton of fun to engage Kids, they want to know, and teachers, you know you've got the secret sauce. When the students are engaged in the pursuit of truth in your math class and they've lost track of time, they lost track of that all-important question, right? Will this be on the test, right? You know you've got something, and you can get them to notice when that happens that they're doing something that they're made for, right? A lot of people want me to start with math because it's hard for us to imagine math, because I think our first instinct when we hear about this idea is that we would add Catholic content to our courses. And please do. And by all means, in art and history and literature and world languages, there's no shortage of Catholic content, and our students should know their own heritage, artistic, historical, all that kind of stuff. That's great. But I want to say, for our purposes, what we did with math and what we can do in all the subjects is not only not just content, but we can think about it, we might call it, from a Catholic context. What does it mean in a Catholic worldview to pursue this? And so what we would do if we had more time is we would look at a bunch of different subject areas, and we would look at what approaching them from a Catholic point of view looks like, whether or not there's easy Catholic content to be added. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about art. I like to think of art as the inverse of math. One of the things, you know, in our culture, we might think of math and art as like opposite ends of a spectrum. One's more objective, one's more subjective. People might think that way. I think one of the things that math and art have in common is humans are the only things we know that do them, right? And if you think about what we said about math abstracting from the physical into the spiritual, art goes the other direction. Art starts in the spiritual realm and moves into the material realm. And if we want to communicate something of ourselves, we have to put it in oil and paint or sculpture, or maybe just manipulating the airwaves in a room to get something in me to you through a physical medium. By the way, that's the doctrine of the incarnation, right? The second person of the Trinity is not material, but becomes material, enters history, and takes on matter to communicate with us, right? And to invite us into relationship. Within our tradition, there's no shortage of reflection on this idea of God as artist, that creation is God's work of art, that each individual student in our classroom is a work of art. The incarnation is sometimes described as God's masterpiece. If you haven't read J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories, please read Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. It's an incredible piece of work. And in that piece of work, he talks about humans as sub-creators. The idea is, if you are made in the image and likeness of a creator, then you also are a creator. And you will find yourself in creative act. He calls us sub-creators to distinguish our acts from God's act of creation, right? So we don't make something from nothing and hold everything in being. We're responsible to creation as it exists, but within creation as it exists, we are creative. And so if you have a student in your art class, and sometimes this happens, right? The student who's, maybe there's trouble at home, maybe there's bullying, something's going on social media, maybe you don't see them come out of their shell, but something happens in art class, right? And they feel seen and understood because they can produce something, they can communicate something of themselves, and the teacher can see them. When they come alive in that moment, you can note for them that it's because they're built to create. They're in the image of a creator, and they're finding something of their vocation as a human person made in God's image when they create something in art. In art, we're looking to share something of ourselves. We're looking to express who we are. Now, in our culture, sometimes self-expression can take on this like weird valence where it's like, I'm going to show you how I'm not like any of you, and so you can't understand me, right? Now, people who produce art that tries to communicate that end up being quite miserable people. Because what the real human drive in art is to share something so that we can be seen, so that we can be understood. And when we make an offer of ourselves through literature, through music, through painting, when we make that offer, we desire someone to see us. And when they do, that self-expression, when it's received, becomes communion. And so we don't only image God as creator, but when that process happens in art, we're imaging the Trinitarian God as well, right? That expression that leads to communion. Have you ever had this experience? You see something beautiful, maybe it's a scene in nature, maybe it's a kind of wistful piece of music, maybe it's a newborn baby. And instead of feeling satisfied, you feel like more longing. Beauty has this weird impact on us where we don't ever get satisfied by it in this world. It's like the opposite of cheesecake, right? You might really like cheesecake, but there is a limit, right? You will never get sick of beauty, right? You always want more. C.S. Lewis says if you find in yourself a desire for something that can't be satisfied in this world, maybe you're made for more than this world, right? And so that encounter with beauty that drives us to seek the ultimate source of beauty is something we can certainly highlight in our art classes. And this leads to my last point on art. Art is where human beings try to express their longing for the infinite. There's a remarkable tradition, actually, of atheist and agnostic artists using religious themes because they say that's the only symbol set that is deep enough to try get at my longing, my gratitude, my something that my own worldview doesn't give me the tools to express, right? And so in a Catholic school, we don't need to only study Catholic art. In fact, we should study Catholic art, but we should also be studying non-Catholic art because we fully expect that human beings who are built to pursue truth and beauty and goodness will find it at least some of the time. And as Catholics, we're convinced that we can be enriched by great art no matter what the religion or culture of the person who produced it. On this feast of St. John Paul II, I'll quote from his letter to artists. If you haven't read John Paul's letter to artists, I recommend it to you. It's actually, you could read it with high school students. At least you could read excerpts of it with high school students. John Paul says, even beyond its typically religious expression, true art has a close affinity with the world of faith, so that even in situations where culture and the church are far apart, art remains a kind of bridge to religious experience. We're going to sing a song together. I'm going to sing the first line of the chorus, and you're going to sing the next line of the chorus. And I'm not going to put the lyrics on the screen, and I'm not going to tell you what the song is, because I don't need to, because everyone knows the song. Are we ready? All right. Take me down to the paradise city. The grass is green, the girls are pretty. And how do you all know that? Do you recognize this image? This is the cover art for Appetite for Destruction. Maybe one of the greatest rock albums of all time, fight me. But could you find a better image for this quote from John Paul II, right? Where culture and the church are far, it's borderline sacrilegious, the imagery. And on that album, with an ugly cover and an ugly name, when Axl Rose wants to talk about his deepest longing, he doesn't even pretend not to use religious language, right? It's called Paradise City, right? And we can look at the structure of the song. I go into it in some detail in the book. But he's captured something about human longing that made such an impact that 40 years, yes, that's how old we are, 40 years almost after this came out, I can do that in any auditorium or classroom in North America, and 90% of the people in the crowd can sing it back to me, right? He's tapped into something. Even when he was far away, he's built, and Jackie talked about this last night too, right? He's built for the same thing, and he's seeking the same thing, and art is where humans do that work, right? One of the things I'll hear sometimes is I'll talk about art from, art as, following a Trinitarian pattern, and they're like, well, that's great if you have a PhD in theology, but of course we can't expect that of everyone. So what do we do? And I want to share with you now, in very short scope, part of workshops I do with teachers, because very often they'll start with this sense of, I'm not going back to school to get another degree now. How am I supposed to do this? And it's remarkable how far you can move the needle once you just change the lenses a little bit, right? Now, of course, teachers are learners, and we should always continue to learn more. And as Catholic teachers learning about our subject specialization from a Catholic point of view, we should all be doing it. But there's some really basic starting points that I've found. They're not exhaustive. You might find others, but I'll share a few with you that I've found have worked really well to help sort of change the lenses so it becomes more obvious how you might think about your subject area from a Catholic point of view. When I do workshops, I give teachers 3 questions. The first one I ask them to think about is, what does the very existence of this subject teach us about the human person, right? We talked about math and art. We don't know anything else that does math or anything else that does art. So what is it about us, right? Well, we're the only things we know that are physical and spiritual, right? That we have rational souls and material bodies. And math and art are both the interplay of those kinds of things, right? What does it mean about us that we do history? What does it mean about us that we're interested in social studies, right? What is social study? How do we live together well? That's the question, right? A second question we can look at. What does this subject teach us about God and God's relationship with creation? For a lot of us, our minds might go to science on this one, and that's great, right? Science and math teaching us about beauty and order and intelligibility. If we had time to go through literature, one of the things I look at is the creation story in Genesis, where God creates with words, right? God creates with language. And the import of that, the Jews lived in Babylon when that story came to its final form as we have it. And the story they heard from the Babylonians was that their god, Marduk, had created with violence, right? He had slain the great chaos dragon of the deep, Tiamat, and created human beings as slaves to the gods from her entrails, right? So there's, what are people for? There's your answer, right? And I don't know if we're that different from the Babylonians. We use different metaphors, but I think, a lot of us might feel like there's powers greater than us that are happy to work us to death, right? But the Jews say, no, the sword is not the metaphor we want for God's creative act. We want the word. God creates by speaking. And if you think about what that means, it's something like God does not coerce and overpower, but God engages us in our freedom, right? When as teachers or parents, when we find the right words to say the true thing that unlocks the unfreedom that was going on with our student or our child, we know that we can have profound influence with words, but that influence isn't coercive, at least if we're using words rightly. And that's the metaphor that the Bible chooses to describe God's relationship with creation, right? And so we can think about the responsibility that comes with language and using it rightly, and how that follows from how God uses language with us. I put this one last because it would be almost too easy. If you put the question of values, what values are at play in the study of this subject? If you put it first, there's values at play in every single subject. And I don't want to reduce a Catholic worldview to ethics. Ethics are important, but I don't want to reduce our engagement to only ethical questions, so I put it third, but it's still an important question, right? We can all imagine, with scientific knowledge, for instance, how do we use our knowledge well or poorly? Even something like art. The question of what's the difference between art and propaganda, for example, would be an interesting thing to put before your students. And that's a question about values, right? I've seen it happen over and over and over again in workshops with teachers. Give them time to sit in small groups and prompt them with these questions, and they will come up with remarkable things. And they'll very often they'll start with things that they think like, well, you can't do it here, right? I can't do it with fractions. I can't do it. Last week in Billings, what was it? It was the present progressive tense. What do you got for me, Doc? What are we going to do with the present progressive? So we started thinking about what it is that humans are, that we use tenses. Well, you don't use tenses unless you live in time and space, and unless you need to orient things in time when you talk about them to other people. And then you can make choices. It only makes sense for the kind of creature that is situated in history the way we are. And so you can say, like, does God use tenses? No. God's in the eternal present. And all of a sudden, we were having this really interesting conversation about tenses and the human person, but it was originally imagined that it was just a sort of tedious, complicated thing that kids have to memorize. Now, it still is, kind of. But they can think about who they are, what kind of creature they are while they're doing that kind of thing. You don't, by the way, you don't need to do it in every single class, and if it feels artificial, like, pull the chute. Like, live to fight another day, right? You don't need to do it in a tacked-on, artificial way, but the point is, you can do it. You can learn to think about all the things from a Catholic point of view if you have some questions that are sort of, crack the question open. I never imagined that there was such a thing as an aviation teacher. And then I met an aviation teacher in Leonardtown, Maryland. And so I thought, well, this is an interesting test case. How would we do this with a subject that I've never thought about, right? So I was in Vancouver a few weeks after I got back from Maryland, and I was working with a group of Catholic school administrators, and I said, let's take these questions and put them to you and see what you come up with for a subject that I'm guessing almost none of you are expert in, right? And none of you are high school aviation teachers. Am I wrong? Any high school aviation teachers? And I didn't give them hints other than the questions. I said, you guys have at it and see what you... And it took not very long. In 10 or 12 minutes, we were talking about Icarus, right? And flying too close to the sun. We were talking about defying gravity from the musical Wicked. Flight as this, if we think about question 1, flight as this like paradigmatic image of human striving. Humans are not satisfied with where they start, and flight is almost always in literature and culture this metaphor for not wanting to be tied down. And that has a good side, right? The human striving beyond, because it tells us we're made for more than this, but also flight in our literature, this is Icarus, becomes a cautionary tale about human pride. And and it just went on and on and on, right? Why do angels have wings? Why do angels have wings, right? It's an image of transcendence, right? Of not being bound in a certain way. And so it did not take us long where we could have a unit that you could put at the front end of an aviation. Of course, you're still going to learn all the things you need to learn in an aviation class to fly a plane. But you might start in the first week of class by thinking about flight in the context of human culture and human ambition and human vocation and human stewardship, all before God, right? And the third question, I don't even have to give you an example. What values are at play? I mean, if you don't know the story, right? When they first invented airplanes, they thought, well, no more war. Do you know this story, right? There won't be any more war with airplanes because you'd be able to fly over the enemy lines and you'd see the enemy massed and you'd say, well, deterrence, I'm not going to fight. Look at this. And then someone had the idea that you could pull the pin on a grenade and throw it while you were flying over the enemy, and within, 25 years, we had Hiroshima, right? So values questions are not hard to come up with in any of these contexts. A last thing, and I'm slightly embarrassed to share this with you because you know this better than I do, but in case it's a helpful refresher, I've had experiences where administrators say, we talk to teachers about doing this. We want to teach every subject from a Catholic point of view. Maybe it becomes a box you check on a lesson plan, right? And then you cold call the teacher, right? You show up in class unexpected and they didn't know you were coming and they scramble to get the Catholic in any way they can. And the results are not encouraging usually in that context. And so, and again, this is stuff but one thing you can do is you can start by having a conversation with that teacher. Let's pick something that you're going to teach 3 months from now, right? You've got a unit coming up on the American Revolution, or take your pick, whatever you want. Let's sit down and chat about it, and maybe we'll use those questions to start thinking about it from a Catholic point of view. and bounce ideas off each other and then come up with a plan, and maybe they bring the plan to you and you can support them in that. And then instead of cold calling and dropping in, you can be invited, like invite me into your classroom when you want to give this a shot, right? And so then you can drop in and observe in that kind of context when they were prepared for you. And then you have an opportunity afterwards to talk about how it went, right? How did this go? What went well? Did it feel artificial? Did it work authentically? How did the students respond? You know, all that kind of stuff that you would do. And then you might even take that back to a staff room and you might share your experience, and others can try the same kind of thing, right? I've worked with lots of different schools. They have variations on this kind of process, and you can build over time, right? Start with just a small handful of things. The trick is our teachers, by and large, were not trained to do this work, right? So many of them were trained in secular institutes or other places. If you do it a handful of times, and you get that feedback and you build that culture where that kind of experimentation and feedback loop is welcome, it won't take long, I suspect, before it becomes a kind of second nature, before you start seeing with these kinds of lenses.